Millionaire leaves everything behind to live a simple life with the waitress who loved him. First picture, an immaculate penthouse suite high above the bustling lights of Manhattan. A solitary figure stands by the floor-to-ceiling window, gazing down at a world he once controlled with the flick of a pen. Thomas Lansing, a self-made millionaire, had everything: glitz, power, and a name that resonated in elite circles. Yet a single memory gnaws at him, the warmth of a small-town diner where a waitress named Diana Harper first saw the man beneath the wealth. What if money can't buy real love? What if the life he constructed is nothing but a gilded cage? A heart-wrenching choice awaits him. Thomas Lansing was born into an environment that might lead one to believe his path was preordained. His father, Gregory Lansing, was the force behind Lansing Capital Investments, a financial powerhouse that soared during the tech boom of the late 1990s. Everyone in New York's investment circles recognized the Lansing name, and by the time Thomas was in high school, he was already regarded as the heir apparent to a billion-dollar empire. Yet behind that polished veneer, the Lansing family bore deep emotional scars, invisible to those outside their immediate circle. When Thomas was just 5, his mother, Helen Lansing, passed away unexpectedly from a heart condition. Gregory, devastated by grief, channeled his pain into building Lansing Capital Investments into a juggernaut. He spent less and less time at home. Thomas was raised largely by nannies, personal tutors, and well-meaning but distant relatives. He grew up understanding the language of profit and loss more fluently than love or nurturing. From an early age, Thomas's talents were undeniable. He showed a precocious knack for problem-solving, devouring books on economics and business strategy like other children devoured comic books. By the time he was 17, he'd earned a place at a prestigious boarding school upstate. There, his roommate was Benjamin Carter, a quiet boy who introduced him to the world of philosophical novels and volunteer work. Benjamin's family was decidedly middle class, and they lived in a modest home in Albany. Spending time with the Carters, Thomas first tasted the warmth of a traditional family weekend: BBQs, board games, laughter that seemed to come from the soul. Still, that sense of comfort was elusive. The gravity of the Lansing legacy pulled him back into a gilded orbit. Gregory expected Thomas to become a younger, sharper version of himself, a powerhouse investor, a ruthless deal-maker, someone who wouldn't hesitate to strike down competition. Despite the occasional pang of conscience, Thomas strove to meet these sky-high expectations. At Harvard University, where he majored in economics, Thomas sharpened his skills to a razored edge. His professors praised him as a brilliant strategist. His classmates deferred to him in group projects. He spent summers interning on Wall Street, earning the attention of major players in finance. Even Mark Cuban once shook his hand at a seminar, telling him he was a bright up-and-comer. All signs pointed to a future of unstoppable success. But a subtle gnawing feeling in Thomas's chest told him that wealth and power, while mesmerizing, only decorated a deeper emptiness inside. He could place deals together like pieces of a puzzle. He could read charts, analyze data, and confidently advise older executives. But the real question, who was Thomas Lansing beyond his father's shadow, remained unanswered. He might never have explored that question fully, if not for a seemingly trivial detour after graduation, a road trip with Benjamin Carter. Among the neon-lit highways and unassuming small towns, Thomas found himself in a humble diner in Pennsylvania. The waitress who served him that day, Diana Harper, was an ordinary woman on the surface, but something in her eyes held a reflection of everything Thomas was missing. It was a moment so small he barely registered its significance. But that single day would haunt him for years to come, weaving itself into the fabric of his fate. It was the summer after college graduation. Thomas and Benjamin decided to embark on a celebratory road trip rather than diving straight into the corporate fray. It wasn't that Thomas doubted his future on Wall Street. He saw it as inevitable. But a part of him yearned for a brief taste of unstructured freedom, a final indulgence before the Lansing name pulled him into its gravitational field for good. They drove a beat-up Honda Civic that Benjamin had borrowed from his uncle, armed with little more than an old atlas and a vague plan to head west. They breezed through scenic byways and small towns. One late afternoon, they found themselves in a little Pennsylvania town called Greenfield. They were hungry, tired, and had no idea where to rest for the night. A peeling sign that read Rosie's Diner caught their eye, its neon flickering erratically. The moment Thomas walked in, he felt an unusual sense of calm. The diner was simple red leather booths, a jukebox in the corner playing oldies, and the aroma of fresh coffee hanging in the air. It was worlds away from the starched tablecloths and hushed conversation of the elite restaurants his father preferred. A waitress approached with a welcoming smile. "What can I get for you fellas?" she asked in a gentle voice. Her name tag read Diana Harper. She looked to be in her early 20s, her blonde hair tied back in a ponytail, and her blue eyes sparkled with a warmth that felt instantly familiar. Thomas ordered a bacon cheeseburger, Benjamin a stack of pancakes. Diana jotted it down and disappeared behind the counter. When she returned to fill their water glasses, Diana struck up a conversation, simple things at first, like the unusual thunderstorm the night before and how Greenfield was about to host its annual county fair. As she spoke, she directed most of her attention at Thomas. It wasn't flirting exactly, it was curiosity. He was used to people feigning interest, to curry favor classmates angling for access to his father's connections, professors eager to name-drop a Lansing in their references. Diana's interest, though, felt genuine, almost disarming. Thomas found himself telling her about the road trip and their plan to find America before plunging into high finance. He caught himself halfway through, surprised at his own openness. Diana smiled and said she envied their freedom. She confessed she had always dreamed of traveling beyond Pennsylvania, but never got the chance. After dinner, as Thomas and Benjamin deliberated where to spend the night, Diana mentioned that her parents owned a small bed and breakfast nearby. She scribbled an address on a napkin with neat handwriting and suggested they could ask for her father, Frank Harper, who'd give them a fair deal. That night, after settling into the cozy rustic room at the Harpers' bed and breakfast, Thomas lay awake, replaying Diana's smile in his head. The day had been ordinary by most standards, just a plate of diner food and small-town conversation, but for Thomas it was extraordinary in its simplicity and sincerity. He felt tethered to a reality he rarely touched, the honest, unassuming world of everyday people. Thomas and Benjamin stayed for 2 days, partly because a heavy rainstorm swept through the region, washing out several roads, but mostly because Thomas found reasons to return to Rosie's Diner, refills of coffee that turned into hour-long chats with Diana. They talked about life, about dreams, about the difference between being alone and being lonely. For one brief moment, Thomas forgot the Lansing legacy, forgot about the looming future on Wall Street. Instead, he was simply a man enchanted by a waitress whose eyes spoke of empathy and kindness. When the rain cleared, they packed their car. Diana came to wave them off. She pressed a slip of paper into Thomas's hand. It had her phone number, hastily written. "Stay in touch," she said somewhat shyly. Thomas felt the briefest flutter of hope. Then reality knocked. He was a Lansing. He had a destiny to fulfill. He couldn't possibly linger in Greenfield. And so the diner in Pennsylvania receded in the rearview mirror. But in Thomas's mind, it glowed with a comforting light, a memory he never quite let go of, though he'd soon bury it beneath the avalanche of ambition and responsibility that awaited him in New York City. When Thomas returned to New York, his father Gregory wasted no time. With a stern handshake, he welcomed his son into Lansing Capital Investments. Though Thomas yearned to share tales of his trip, especially about Greenfield and the girl named Diana, he found Gregory uninterested in personal anecdotes. There were urgent acquisitions underway, important deals to close, and Thomas had to prove himself worthy of the Lansing name. Thomas was assigned to a mentor, Alan Thompson, a respected senior partner known for grooming young talent. Alan was a polished man in his mid-50s, with salt and pepper hair and a reputation for forging alliances with top-tier clients. Under Alan's tutelage, Thomas learned how to negotiate with corporate titans, how to sense weaknesses in a competitor's structure, and how to leverage Lansing Capital's deep pockets to strike fear into any opposing party. Long hours blurred into weekends. Thomas's dorm-style living was swapped for a sleek bachelor apartment with views of the Hudson River. He threw himself into the demands of his new position, adopting the relentless pace his father insisted upon. Any vestige of personal life, let alone a memory of a small diner waitress, was shoved into the background. On the rare occasions that Thomas did allow himself to think about Diana, it was late at night, or on the few Sundays he spent alone. Her number lay tucked in his wallet. Sometimes he toyed with the idea of calling her, but he never dialed. Pride, fear, or perhaps the sense that the two worlds could never coexist, held him back. Within a year, Thomas proved his mettle. He orchestrated a successful merger between a budding tech startup and a stagnant manufacturing conglomerate, turning Lansing Capital a sizable profit. Gregory, visibly impressed, began to include Thomas in high-level meetings. His business circle expanded to real estate magnates, fashion moguls, and even philanthropic legends. He once sat at the same dinner table as Bill Gates during a fundraising gala. Every success further cemented Thomas's commitment to living up to his father's expectations. Yet with each corporate triumph, a little piece of Thomas's soul felt compromised. The Lansing brand, once a point of familial pride, began to feel stifling. He saw how his father manipulated relationships, how deals were sometimes sealed with cunning threats, disguised as professional courtesy. More than once, Thomas found himself pushing smaller businesses into risky ventures for Lansing Capital's gain. He justified it to himself, "It's just business," but the moral disquiet clung to him like a stubborn shadow. Alan Thompson picked up on Thomas's undercurrent of unease. One day, after a successful negotiation, they sat in Alan's corner office, sipping scotch. "Thomas," Alan said gently, "you have potential beyond measure. Just remember to know what you want out of life. Money, respect, power, legacy, sometimes they don't all come together." Thomas offered a tight smile, unwilling to unravel his doubts in front of a mentor he both admired and feared. He wondered if Alan, too, had once stared into the abyss of these choices. If so, how had he chosen? Perhaps Alan had reached a compromise with his conscience. Or maybe he'd suppressed it entirely. The months rolled on. Thomas's star continued to rise, bringing him a six-figure salary, a glossy sports car, and an influential network that expanded with each social event. He was introduced to Samantha Carter, the daughter of a prominent senator, though they were not related to his old friend Benjamin. Samantha was gorgeous and well-educated, a socialite with philanthropic ambitions that aligned well with Lansing Capital's image. Their relationship began amicably, a union of convenience for business dinners and political connections. Gregory approved, seeing in Samantha the perfect partner for his son's further ascent. Yet amid the glamour, Thomas sometimes woke up in a cold sweat, haunted by an inexplicable emptiness. He dreamt of the small diner and the warm smile of Diana Harper. He would wake with a pang in his chest, as though he'd glimpsed a parallel life where he wasn't burdened by money and legacy. More than once, he fished out that slip of paper with Diana's phone number. Each time, he folded it back and returned it to the drawer, uncertain whether calling her would be an act of courage or foolishness. Years drifted by, And Thomas, now in his late 20s, stood on the cusp of a major promotion. Alan Thompson was set to retire soon, and Gregory Lansing wanted Thomas to fill his mentor's position as senior partner. Yet, even as opportunities abounded, Thomas found his restlessness growing. He felt like a puppet dancing to strings he hadn't chosen. At a corporate retreat in the Catskills, Lansing Capital's top brass convened for strategy workshops and team-building activities. They stayed in a luxurious mountain lodge, complete with a spa and a Michelin star chef. Networking over gourmet meals, forging alliances with bankers from Zurich, and hashing out future expansions, this was the life Thomas was supposed to want. During a mandatory team bonding exercise, each participant drew a question from a bowl and answered in front of the group. Thomas's question read, "What is one regret you have?" His chest tightened. He forced a casual smile and said something safe. Missing out on a trip to Europe after college. But inside, he whispered the truth, not calling Diana Harper. When the retreat ended, Thomas decided to stop by a local coffee shop before driving back to the city. He placed his order and waited near the counter. Suddenly, a familiar voice behind him asked, "Thomas Lansing? Is that really you?" He turned around. Diana Harper. She was bundled in a winter coat, her cheeks flushed from the cold, eyes still brimming with that same gentle warmth. He nearly spilled his coffee in shock. Diana had recognized him immediately, despite the passing years. She had moved to the Catskills recently to help her cousin manage a ski lodge. They exchanged awkward pleasantries, the tension of old memories pressing around them. Diana still wore a small silver locket around her neck. Thomas remembered how she used to nervously fiddle with it at Rosie's diner. She had more confidence now, but the sincerity in her gaze remained. Their conversation was short, as both were pressed for time. But Thomas impulsively asked for her number this time, determined to use it. Diana gave him a hesitant smile and typed her contact into his phone. "Let's keep in touch," she said softly. That night, Thomas couldn't stop thinking about the coincidence. It felt like fate, or at least a second chance. He called Diana the following week, inviting her to dinner in Manhattan. She agreed. The day of their meetup, Thomas's heart pounded harder than it had for any corporate deal. He wore his best suit but worried it might be too formal. They met at a classy restaurant in Midtown. Diana looked out of place amid the polished marble and tuxedoed waiters, but her graceful composure radiated a simple beauty. She explained how she'd left Greenfield after her parents sold the bed and breakfast, searching for a fresh start in a bigger world. She'd found work in the Catskills, coordinating ski events, and continuing to waitress part-time. Thomas told her about his meteoric rise at Lansing Capital, omitting the moral discontent stirring within him. She asked if he was happy. He dodged the question, claiming he was busy. Then he shifted the focus to her life, her hopes, her day-to-day joys. Over the course of the meal, he realized how much he'd missed listening to a voice that was neither impressed nor intimidated by his wealth. At the end of the evening, they stepped onto the sidewalk. The city lights shimmered, cabs honked, and a mild breeze brushed past them. Thomas, gripping Diana's hand gently, felt more grounded than he had in years. He offered to drive her home, but she declined, saying she'd prefer to catch a train. "It's simpler," she shrugged with a soft smile. He watched her walk away, her figure eventually blending into the throng of pedestrians. In that moment, Thomas felt his carefully constructed world tilt. The city that had once seemed like the center of everything now seemed hollow. For the first time in a long while, he wanted something more than power or money. He wanted the genuine connection he felt whenever he was near Diana Harper. For several weeks, Thomas juggled the demands of Lansing Capital with an emerging romance that caught him completely off guard. He and Diana arranged a few more meetups, sometimes in Manhattan, sometimes in the Catskills. They strolled through Central Park, visited local art galleries, and found themselves talking for hours in humble cafes where no one cared that Thomas drove a flashy sports car or commanded millions in assets. With Diana, Thomas rediscovered the simple joys he'd long suppressed. He'd laugh at her witty observations or feel a peaceful contentment as they walked hand in hand through a quiet neighborhood. Yet in the background, a knot of tension tightened inside him. He hadn't told his father or anyone at Lansing Capital about Diana. Samantha Carter, the socialite he was loosely dating, remained in the picture. In truth, the relationship with Samantha was more about mutual benefits than love. Thomas knew he'd have to face that truth soon. Matters took a turn when Lansing Capital found itself embroiled in a high-stakes financial fiasco. A major investment in a European telecom giant turned sour. The company's shares plummeted amid scandals of fraud, and Lansing Capital was left teetering on the brink of huge losses. Gregory Lansing summoned every senior partner to an emergency meeting. In a room thick with tension, Thomas felt out of his depth. Alan Thompson, just weeks away from retirement, advised caution. Maybe it was time to cut their losses and salvage what remained. Gregory, however, refused to show weakness. He insisted on a risky approach, doubling down on their position to bluff the market into thinking Lansing Capital had unwavering faith in the telecom's recovery. Late nights returned with a vengeance. Thomas's phone buzzed relentlessly, clients anxious about their investments, colleagues demanding updates. He barely had a moment to sleep, let alone spend time with Diana. When she called to check in, he could only offer curt apologies and vague assurances that he'd see her soon. Behind closed doors, Gregory confided to Thomas that Lansing Capital's entire reputation was on the line. If they admitted to a major error, their investors might flee, causing a domino effect. "We didn't build this empire to cower in the face of adversity," Gregory barked, ignoring Alan's counsel. "We fight. We show them we are Lansing." Caught in the whirlwind, Thomas found himself forging questionable alliances, coaxing smaller investors into taking bigger stakes to buoy the telecom's share price. He felt the moral friction intensifying. He was effectively persuading people to put their money into a sinking ship, just so Lansing Capital could maintain its image. But the avalanche had started, and it was too late to reverse course without catastrophic consequences. With each passing day, Thomas's conscience screamed louder. Late at night, he'd stare at the city lights, remembering the serenity of a small diner in Pennsylvania. He thought of Diana, whose sincerity reminded him of a purer existence untainted by corporate deceit. And yet, he felt trapped in an endless cycle of high-stakes maneuvering and glossy PR statements. Samantha Carter, too, became a pressing issue. She attended a charity gala with Thomas, smiling for the cameras, fueling gossip columns about a possible engagement. Gregory encouraged the rumors, seeing a union with a senator's daughter as an invaluable asset to Lansing Capital's political reach. Thomas, cornered by family expectations and public speculation, found himself playing along even though his heart was torn in another direction. Eventually, the telecom fiasco reached its breaking point. Regulators announced an investigation into fraudulent accounting. The stock crashed. Overnight, Lansing Capital lost a significant chunk of its portfolio value. Investors panicked and the media pounced. Gregory fell ill with stress. Alan Thompson, forced to delay his retirement, scrambled to contain the damage. In the aftermath, Thomas, exhausted and disgusted, couldn't stop the spiral of self-doubt. Was this truly the legacy he wanted to uphold? When the dust settled, Lansing Capital was still standing, but barely. And in the rubble of dashed promises and ethical grey areas, Thomas recognized a horrifying truth. He had become the kind of man he never wanted to be. The financial crisis at Lansing Capital left Thomas feeling hollow and adrift. Headlines in major newspapers questioned the firm's credibility, and social media buzzed with speculation about layoffs, lawsuits, and even potential bankruptcy. Gregory Lansing, having barely dodged a complete meltdown, retreated to his penthouse, citing health issues. He insisted Thomas handle the media scrutiny, effectively making him the new face of Lansing Capital. During this period, Diana tried to support Thomas as best she could. She offered a listening ear, her soft-spoken words a balm to his frayed nerves. Whenever possible, he would escape to the Catskills to see her. On one of those evenings, they sat on a wooden bench overlooking a pristine lake. The sun dipped behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. Thomas confided in her his frustrations, the moral dilemmas, the sense that he was trapped in a golden cage. Diana rested her hand on his. "You're more than what your father wants you to be, Thomas. That's what I saw in you all those years ago at Rosie's diner." Tears pricked his eyes. "I can't just walk away," he said, gaze fixed on the shimmering lake. "I have obligations, employees, investors." "My father built this from nothing." Diana hesitated, then gently asked, "What about your own happiness? What about doing what you believe is right?" Thomas couldn't answer. He held her hand, grateful for her presence, but his heart pounded with an uncomfortable truth. He was so entrenched in Lansing Capital's identity that the thought of leaving felt impossible, even if staying felt equally unbearable. Back in Manhattan, the fallout from the telecom debacle continued to swirl. Gregory, recovering from stress-related complications, barked orders from his home. His eyes, once fierce, now shone with desperation. He demanded that Thomas salvage the company's image at all costs. A PR blitz was launched, painting Lansing Capital as a victim of corporate fraud. Confidential memos circulated, urging staff to refrain from discussing the fiasco publicly. Thomas found himself orchestrating damage control so relentless he hardly slept. Amid this chaos, Samantha Carter's father, Senator Richard Carter, publicly voiced sympathy for Lansing Capital, calling it a cornerstone of American enterprise. Gossip magazines speculated that an engagement between Thomas and Samantha would be announced soon. Gregory, always strategic, encouraged the rumor he believed that tying the Lansing name to a respected political family might renew investor confidence. Torn between duty and truth, Thomas delayed meeting with Samantha to clarify their relationship. She, for her part, seemed to assume that the ring was inevitable. She continued scheduling lavish dinner parties, posing for tabloids, and reminding Thomas of how powerful they could be together. Nowhere in that picture was there room for a small-town girl from Pennsylvania or for Thomas's sense of ethics. One evening, after a particularly grueling day, Thomas sought refuge in the quiet corners of his apartment. He scrolled through old text messages from Diana, eventually pausing on a message she'd sent after the fiasco. "I believe in you no matter what happens." He closed his eyes, the weight of betrayal and self-loathing pressing down on him. If he truly cared for Diana, how could he continue living this double life? Determined to find some semblance of moral ground, he scheduled a meeting with Alan Thompson, who had been a steady, if conflicted, presence throughout. Late at night, in Alan's office overlooking the city, Thomas poured out his doubts. "I don't know if I can do this anymore," he admitted, voice trembling. Alan listened with sympathetic eyes. "Thomas, you have to decide what kind of man you want to be. Money and power can build an empire, but they can also destroy your soul. Don't let your father's legacy become your prison." Thomas nodded, resolution forming in his mind. Perhaps it was time to break free, but how to do so without leaving everything he'd ever known in ruins? That question weighed heavily on his mind. The only thing he felt sure of was Diana. She was the constant in a maelstrom of shifting alliances and corporate chaos, a flicker of hope in a life that had become far too dark. Buoyed by Alan Thompson's advice, Thomas decided it was time to confront the tangled threads of his life. First on his list was Samantha Carter. He could no longer pretend that their arrangement, whatever it was, had any real future. One evening, he invited her to a private lounge in an upscale hotel. Candles flickered and smooth jazz played in the background. Samantha arrived in an elegant black dress, eyes glittering with expectation. Thomas took a deep breath. "Samantha, we need to talk about us." Her smile faltered slightly. "What about us?" she asked, her voice cautious yet tinged with confidence. She likely assumed a proposal was coming. Thomas explained, with as much tact as he could muster, that he valued her as a friend and respected her ambitions. But he did not love her. He admitted there was someone else, someone he felt truly connected to. Samantha sat in stunned silence, her polished composure cracking. "Is it that waitress I've heard rumors about?" She spat, her voice trembling with indignation. Thomas nodded, unwilling to lie. Samantha's eyes flashed with a mixture of hurt and fury. She railed at him, accusing him of throwing away a perfect alliance. "My father gave Lansing Capital his public support," she hissed. "You're choosing a nobody over everything we've built." Thomas's face reddened, but he held firm. "I never wanted to build anything that was just a facade. I'm sorry." Samantha stormed out, leaving behind the remnants of a relationship that had always been more business transaction than romance. Next, Thomas had to face Gregory Lansing. His father had caught wind of the rift with Samantha and was furious. In the lavish study of their family penthouse, father and son squared off. Oil paintings and antique sculptures loomed over them, silent witnesses to decades of Lansing history. "You've humiliated me," Gregory snarled, pacing behind his desk. "The Carters were our last hope to restore credibility. Now you throw it away for some small-town fling? Have you lost your mind?" Thomas inhaled slowly. "I can't live like this anymore, Dad. I'm not happy. Our business is built on manipulation and greed. I can't keep telling lies just to protect our reputation." Gregory's face turned ashen with rage. "Everything I've done has been for you," he thundered. "To give you a legacy. And now you defy me?" Thomas stared at the man who had loomed so large in his life. He saw not just anger, but fear and desperation. "I'm grateful for what you've built," Thomas said, his voice trembling with emotion, "but I need to find my own path." They argued for hours. Gregory threatened to disown him, to strip away all financial support. He accused Thomas of betraying the family. When Thomas finally left, his mind was spinning, but a surge of relief coursed through his veins. He had spoken his truth. For the first time in years, he felt more like himself than the role he had been molded to play. Late that night, Thomas drove to the Catskills. Without warning, he appeared at the ski lodge where Diana lived. She opened the door to her small apartment, startled by his disheveled state. "Thomas, what happened?" she asked, concern filling her voice. In an outpouring of raw emotion, he told her everything: the fight with his father, the broken engagement, the regrets that weighed on his soul. She listened, her eyes brimming with empathy. When he finally paused, she gently guided him to sit on the couch. Without words, she wrapped her arms around him, offering comfort he hadn't felt in a lifetime. "It's not going to be easy," Diana said softly, stroking his hair. "But you've done the hard part. You've been honest. Whatever comes next, you won't face it alone." Thomas stared into her eyes, finding in them a profound solace. Despite the chaos swirling around him, he felt a strange sense of peace, as though he'd just stepped off a roller coaster ride that had governed his entire existence. He didn't know what the future held: financial ruin, family estrangement, or something else entirely. But he did know one thing: he could no longer keep up the pretense of being a dutiful heir to a broken empire. It was time to start living life on his own terms. Breaking ties with Lansing Capital was akin to dismantling a fortress from within. Over the following weeks, Thomas methodically delegated his responsibilities to other partners. He informed the board he would be taking an indefinite leave, prompting shock and dismay. Gregory Lansing, still fuming, refused to speak with him. Rumors swirled among the staff. Some believed Thomas was having a breakdown. Others whispered that he was being forced out. The official story, per the firm's PR machine, was that Thomas needed to focus on his health after the stressful telecom fiasco. Behind the scenes, lawyers scrambled to sort out contracts, non-disclosure agreements, and settlement clauses. Thomas insisted on severing ties cleanly, rejecting any golden parachute his father's attorneys offered. He wanted to walk away without carrying further guilt or obligation. In the end, the board agreed to a compromise. Thomas would resign as a senior partner, retaining only a minority stake in the company, a stake that brought no voting rights or day-to-day influence. He left behind his corner office, his illusions of grandeur, and the relentless, soul-numbing lifestyle that had haunted him for years. During this tumultuous transition, Diana stood by him. She provided calm perspectives and reassurance whenever Thomas doubted his decision, reminding him of the strength it took to break free from a legacy. "You're giving yourself a chance to be truly happy," she would say, brushing a comforting hand across his cheek, "and that's worth any price." The final rift came when Gregory Lansing sent Thomas a terse message. "If you walk away from Lansing Capital, don't expect to return, and don't bother calling me your father." For 3 days, Thomas carried those words like a brand, searing his flesh. He mourned the father he never truly had, even as he recognized that no amount of success would have satisfied Gregory's insatiable drive for power. With nothing tying him to Manhattan, Thomas decided on a drastic change. He could have purchased a lavish home in any tranquil suburb or retreat, but that would only replicate the hollow comforts he was trying to escape. Instead, he packed what few belongings felt meaningful: a box of childhood photos, a few suits, some mementos from his Harvard days, and headed for the Catskills. There he rented a modest cabin near Diana's ski lodge, nestled among towering pines and crystalline lakes. The morning air was crisp, the nights quiet. For the first time, Thomas woke without the jarring ring of an alarm demanding he rush to the next business meeting. He spent hours wandering the trails with Diana, rediscovering the joy of simply existing without an agenda. Financially, Thomas was still set for life, given the wealth he had already accumulated. However, he began to understand how money could be used to live simply rather than lavishly. He wanted his life to reflect peace, not power. Word of his drastic move spread quickly. Social media lit up with speculation. Had Thomas Lansing gone off the deep end? Was he pulling off some grand philanthropic pivot? Journalists camped outside his father's penthouse, seeking a statement, but Gregory remained silent. A few tabloid reporters braved the mountain roads, hoping to catch a glimpse of the exiled millionaire. Thomas did his best to ignore them, focusing on the restorative rhythms of nature and the quiet contentment he found with Diana. Sometimes at night, lying in bed next to Diana, Thomas wrestled with a lingering guilt. He knew Lansing Capital still operated in the same ethically grey territory he had left. But stepping away didn't eradicate the damage done by his name. Diana reminded him that he couldn't change the past, only the future. "You've made a choice for yourself," she whispered. "That's the best start to making a real difference." Thomas nodded, resolved to move forward. He knew the path would not be simple. He would have to carve out a new identity far from the towers of Manhattan. Yet each morning, as the sun broke over the mountains, he awoke to a sense of relief and gratitude he'd never before experienced. Freedom, it turned out, was worth every sacrifice. In the serene Catskills, Thomas spent his first months adjusting to a rhythm of life he'd only dreamed about. He volunteered part-time at a local community centre, helping to manage budgets and organise events. This work introduced him to neighbours who had no idea he was once a Wall Street titan. They saw only a polite, somewhat reserved newcomer who was good with numbers. Diana continued her job coordinating events at the ski lodge. When they weren't busy, they'd share lunch on a sunlit terrace overlooking snowy peaks. The two of them were forging a new, simpler life together, based not on status or convenience, but genuine affection and shared values. Despite the tranquility, complications arose. Samantha Carter reappeared unexpectedly, arriving one chilly morning without warning. She drove up in a sleek black SUV, stepping out in designer boots that sank awkwardly into the snow. Thomas was at the community centre when she cornered him by the coffee machine. Her face was pinched with frustration and something that resembled desperation. "I need your help," she said curtly, explaining that her father, Senator Carter, was launching a new education initiative, and Lansing Capital was refusing to fund it due to internal financial woes. Samantha hinted that if Thomas used his influence, or at least his leftover shares, he could encourage Lansing Capital to back the project. She offered him a chance to return to the city as her partner. "We can make things right," she insisted, "and you'll restore your family's name." The offer stung. For a moment, old habits kicked in, thinking about father's approval, the corporate power he once wielded. But then he remembered the emptiness that accompanied that world. He recalled how Samantha had never truly loved him, only the advantages he brought. With a steady voice, he declined. "I'm sorry, Samantha. My priorities have changed." Samantha flared with anger. She accused him of naivete, of abandoning his father in his hour of need, of squandering a life most people envied. "You'll regret this," she snapped, before storming out into the snow, her footprints leading away. Later that day, Thomas confided in Diana about Samantha's visit. Though Diana tried to remain composed, he could sense her worry. She knew how deeply ingrained the Lansing name was in Thomas's identity. The next morning she found Thomas silently packing a small duffel bag. A flicker of fear danced in her eyes. "Are you leaving?" she whispered, her voice trembling. Thomas shook his head, pulling her into a reassuring hug. "I just need to visit someone," he said, meaning his father. "I have to try to mend things." He drove down to Manhattan, heart pounding with each mile. The city skyline loomed like a fortress of memories. At the towering residential complex where Gregory lived, Thomas was initially denied entry by private security. Only after insistent pleading did they let him up. In the penthouse, he found his father haggard, eyes sunken, sitting alone in a dimly lit living room. The place felt cold despite its lavish furnishings. Gregory looked at his son with a hardened stare, as if seeing a ghost. "What do you want?" he asked, voice raspy. Thomas took a seat across from him, breathing in the stale air of broken dreams. "I came to see if we could talk," he said quietly. "I'm not here to rejoin Lansing Capital. I wanted to see how you were." His father's jaw clenched. For a long while, neither spoke. Finally, Gregory exhaled. He didn't apologize or ask about Thomas's life in the mountains. Instead, he launched into a half-rant, half-confession about the board's recent decisions, about the firm's precarious standing. Thomas listened, empathetic yet firm in his decision to remain detached. They parted without reconciliation, but also without further vitriol. Gregory simply nodded, as if acknowledging his son's choice, however misguided he believed it to be. Thomas left the penthouse certain that the father he'd always wanted would never truly emerge from Gregory Lansing's towering shadow. Despite that, a sense of finality lifted from his chest as he drove back to the Catskills. He realized that closure doesn't always come neatly wrapped. Sometimes acceptance is the only outcome, and that, in its own way, can be liberating. Thomas's life in the Catskills continued to evolve. His quiet involvement at the community centre soon turned into a more significant project. With his financial expertise and leftover wealth, he began funding educational programs for underprivileged kids in the region. Partnering with local schools, he helped set up workshops on entrepreneurship, coding, and financial literacy skills that small-town kids rarely had access to. Word spread, and more volunteers joined. Diana cheered him on, assisting with event coordination and rallying lodge guests to donate supplies. She beamed with pride each time she saw Thomas working with a group of smiling children or explaining a marketing concept to a wide-eyed teenager. For the first time, Thomas felt he was using his resources to empower others rather than accumulate power for himself. In a small cottage near the ski lodge, the two found a rhythm of domestic contentment. They cooked together, Thomas mastering the art of flipping pancakes without setting off the smoke alarm, and Diana creating hearty soups from her mother's old recipes. During downtime, they lounged by the fireplace, reading or planning the next community event. Sometimes they simply sat in silence, thankful for the newfound serenity that asked for nothing but their presence. Inevitably, his transformation became a media story. A local journalist wrote a feature on the ex-Wall Street prodigy turned small-town philanthropist. Larger outlets picked up the narrative, painting Thomas's journey as a redemption arc. Requests for interviews poured in, but Thomas politely declined most. He didn't want the spotlight or the praise. He wanted to focus on living honestly and cherishing the love he'd found. Only Benjamin Carter, his old boarding school roommate, managed to coax him into a public appearance. Now working at a non-profit focusing on environmental conservation, Benjamin invited Thomas to speak at a virtual conference. Thomas agreed, partly out of friendship, partly to promote his community initiatives. When Thomas logged into the conference, he saw an array of big names. Elon Musk was giving a keynote on renewable energy, Malala Yousafzai discussing global education. Thomas's segment was modest by comparison, focusing on grassroots development in rural areas. Yet, when he spoke, his humility and sincerity resonated with viewers far more than corporate jargon ever could. The conference was a success, earning Thomas new allies who offered to help expand his programs. Though part of him worried about stepping back into high-level networking, he felt safe in the knowledge that this time he was forging connections that aligned with his values. Meanwhile, his relationship with Diana blossomed into a partnership defined by mutual respect and genuine love. She continued to remind him of the person he wanted to be, kind, grounded, and generous. One crisp autumn afternoon, while they were walking a leaf-strewn trail, Thomas paused beside a tranquil creek, taking Diana's hand. Leaves drifted on the water's surface, swirling in slow circles. "This," he said, "is the life I always wanted, even when I didn't know it. Thank you for sticking by me." She smiled, leaning her head on his shoulder. "I'm proud of you, Thomas, for being brave enough to leave everything behind." As they turned to head back, the wind carrying the scent of pine, Thomas found himself thinking about the ring he'd hidden in a drawer at the cottage. It wasn't an ostentatious diamond from a Fifth Avenue jeweler, just a simple gold band engraved with a small heart. He felt an excited, nervous flutter. In a world once dominated by contracts and corporate mergers, he was about to propose something far more meaningful, a promise that couldn't be sealed by wealth, but by genuine devotion. Thomas spent days rehearsing in his mind how he would propose to Diana. Part of him felt self-conscious after all. He'd once inhabited a world where extravagant grand gestures, flashy rings, lavish parties were commonplace. But that was not who he was anymore. He wanted something intimate and honest. One late afternoon, he set up a small picnic by the lake near their cottage. The water glimmered under the fading sun, and the autumn foliage painted the hillsides in fiery reds and golds. A soft breeze rustled the leaves as Diana arrived, her eyes lighting up at the sight of a cozy blanket and a wicker basket loaded with homemade sandwiches, cheese, and her favorite cider. They chatted and laughed, recalling the first time they met at Rosie's diner and the uncanny way their paths had crossed years later. Thomas's heart pounded as dusk crept in, coloring the sky in shades of pink and lavender. He took a deep breath, reached into his jacket, and pulled out a small velvet box. "Diana," he began, voice trembling slightly, "I gave up a world that felt hollow for a life that finally feels real. You are the reason I feel alive, the reason I believe in the possibility of happiness beyond wealth or success. Will you marry me and share this journey with me for the rest of our days?" Tears glistened in Diana's eyes. She didn't hesitate. "Yes," she whispered, a radiant smile breaking across her face. Thomas slipped the ring onto her finger, a modest gold band, a simple expression of a profound commitment. The moment felt perfect, free of the pomp and pageantry that once defined him. They held each other as the sun finally dipped below the horizon, leaving them wrapped in the soft glow of an early autumn night. In the following weeks, they made plans for a small wedding at the lakeside. They invited only a handful of close friends, Benjamin Carter among them, of course, and a few local folks who had become part of their community in the Catskills. Thomas even sent an invitation to Gregory Lansing, though he doubted his father would attend. To Thomas's shock, Gregory arrived on the morning of the wedding, appearing older and more frail than the last time they had spoken. He took a seat in the back row, a slight tremor in his hands, saying little. Thomas initially felt a rush of anxiety, but Diana's steady gaze reminded him to keep calm. During the ceremony, in the clear mountain air, Thomas and Diana recited vows they'd written themselves. Thomas spoke of love, second chances, and the beauty of finding one's true path. Diana promised unwavering support, a love that would endure life's storms and celebrate its blessings. When they sealed their union with a kiss, applause echoed across the lake. Afterward, amidst the muted chatter and laughter of loved ones, Gregory approached, standing awkwardly at the edge of the small reception. He reached into his jacket and handed Thomas a small, worn photograph of Helen Lansing, Thomas's mother. "She would have been proud of you," Gregory murmured, his voice hoarse. Overwhelmed by emotion, Thomas embraced his father. They didn't resolve every wound, nor did Gregory offer a sweeping apology. But in that moment, father and son shared a fragile truce, an unspoken acknowledgement that perhaps some things transcended business and power. Gregory departed soon after, leaving Thomas with the photo and a sense of tentative reconciliation. That evening, Thomas and Diana danced under string lights and a sky filled with stars. The music was gentle, the mood warm with genuine affection. In that instant, surrounded by friends and nature, Thomas felt a deep certainty that he had finally chosen the life he was always meant to live. Married life brought its own gentle rhythms. Thomas and Diana Harper Lansing settled into their modest cottage, rising to the chorus of birds, sharing breakfast while sunlight streamed through the kitchen window. Thomas continued his philanthropic work with the community center, expanding programs to neighboring counties. Diana found her passion in teaching children about nature conservation, using the nearby trails as her classroom. Old habits of corporate life occasionally surfaced. Thomas would catch himself scanning stock tickers or reading financial news out of habit. Each time, he reminded himself that wealth was no longer his master, merely a tool he could use to uplift others. Letters from Lansing Capital arrived from time to time, updates about board decisions and annual reports. He skimmed them, more from curiosity than concern, and then returned to the tasks that genuinely fulfilled him, discussing a new literacy program with local volunteers or helping Diana set up a campsite for an overnight kids' excursion. Diana and Thomas's reputation spread throughout the Catskills. They became known as the friendly couple who organized winter coat drives, who never hesitated to lend a hand or donate resources. In the place of shallow networking dinners, they hosted potlucks with neighbors where laughter was abundant and no one cared about brand labels. As months turned into years, Thomas found his heart expanding with each small gesture of everyday life, like a steaming cup of cocoa shared by the fireplace after a snowfall, or the smiles of children gleefully discovering how to code a simple game on donated laptops. Diana's presence made every moment more poignant. Sometimes they visited Greenfield, strolling past the old Rosie's Diner, now under new ownership, but still offering warm meals and friendly chatter. On one such trip, they popped in for a burger and a slice of pie. The new waitress recognized Thomas from an old newspaper article. "Aren't you that millionaire who gave it all up?" she asked, wide-eyed. Thomas chuckled, glancing at Diana. "I guess so," he said, "but I'd rather be known as the guy who learned what really matters." Though he still carried scars, the paternal love he never fully received, the memories of deals that harmed small businesses, he channeled those regrets into positive change. He helped fund scholarship opportunities, focusing on ethical business practices and community development. He spoke at local colleges, warning students about the moral pitfalls of unchecked ambition. True to his word, Gregory Lansing never fully embraced Thomas's departure from the corporate realm. They remained distant, exchanging only sporadic phone calls or holiday messages. Yet each call was slightly more civil, each message a step closer to mutual respect. Over time they formed a fragile bond, if not the father-son connection Thomas once dreamed of. Occasionally, people asked if Thomas planned to return to the fast-paced financial world. He would smile and answer politely that he was content where he was. Some found it baffling, others admired his courage. Diana, always by his side, felt only relief that he had chosen a path aligned with his soul. And so, a millionaire who once breathed the rarefied air of penthouse suites now woke each day to a life of simplicity and love. Far from being a sacrifice, it was the greatest blessing he could have ever imagined. Thank you, dear friends, for joining us on this emotional journey of determination, heartbreak, and ultimate redemption. We witnessed Thomas Lansing break free from the suffocating chains of corporate power to embrace a simpler but infinitely more meaningful life with the woman who loved him first. Through love, perseverance, and moral courage, he discovered that true wealth isn't measured by bank accounts or boardroom victories, but by the warmth and sincerity of real human connection. If this story touched your heart and reminded you of the power of genuine love, please take a moment to like, share, and subscribe to this channel. Your support helps us bring you more stories that captivate the soul and inspire life's most important transformations. Until next time, remember, real happiness often blooms in the most unexpected places. Thank you for watching, and see you in our next video.